Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, March 9th, 2023. Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw tells a U.S. Senate committee looking into the Ohio train derailment and chemical spill that he is deeply sorry for the impact on the community of East Palestine, and he is determined to make it right. Coming up, portions of today's hearing, and we'll talk about that and proposed rail safety reform legislation with Washington Post transportation reporter Ian Duncan. President Joe Biden at a union training hall in Philadelphia presenting his proposed $6.8 trillion federal budget for fiscal year 2024, which starts this October. His proposal would increase funding for many domestic programs and also raise taxes on the wealthy. The president says it would reduce the federal deficit by $3 trillion over a decade. We'll hear from the president, plus members of Congress of both parties, and talk about the budget proposal with Thomson Reuters White House and economics correspondent Andrea Shalal. Plus, the Senate confirms a new IRS Commissioner. The House passes a bill to block a new regulation on the reach of the Clean Water Act. The CIA director testifies before a House committee on Russia's ability to carry on the war in Ukraine. And some positive thoughts from senators to the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's in the hospital recovering from a concussion after a trip and fall Wednesday night. And we start with the president and CEO of Norfolk Southern in Washington before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee on the train derailment and toxic chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio last month. 38 rail cars, including 11 with hazardous materials, including vinyl chloride, went off the tracks due to an overheated wheel bearing, according to a preliminary investigation. Alan Shaw telling the committee his company is committed to doing what's right to make things right for the town and its residents and the environment.
I want to begin today by expressing how deeply sorry I am for the impact this derailment has had on the residents of East Palestine and the surrounding communities. I've been to East Palestine many times over the past month. I've talked with the leaders, the business owners, the school officials, the clergy, and others throughout the community. They've shared their stories and their concerns about the health of their families and the future of the community they love. I am determined to make this right. Norfolk Southern will clean the site safely, thoroughly, and with urgency. You have my personal commitment. Norfolk Southern will get the job done and help East Palestine thrive. At the direction of and in collaboration with the U.S. EPA, state and local agencies, we are developing and implementing near and longer-term cleanup activities. Air and water monitoring have been in place continuously since the accident, and to date, it consistently indicated that the air is safe to breathe and the water is safe to drink. In terms of community support, we have announced direct investments of over $21 million. We have provided support to more than 4,400 families through Norfolk Southern's Family Assistance Center. We established a $1 million fund available immediately to community leaders who will identify where donations can do the most good for East Palestine. We committed $7.5 million to Pennsylvania for a community relief fund, and we are reimbursing Pennsylvania emergency responders and health and environmental agencies for costs related to the derailment. All of this is just a down payment. We recently signed a lease for a more permanent space in East Palestine. I asked one of our frontline railroaders who lives in East Palestine to take on a new role as a full-time liaison, reporting directly to my office. He is advocating for the community in my office and overseeing distribution of another $1 million. We will be in the community for as long as it takes.
Alan Shaw, president and CEO of Norfolk Southern, the company whose railroad subsidiary operated the train with the toxic chemicals, derailed February 3rd in East Palestine, Ohio. Today in Washington, D.C., testifying before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, asking the CEO about his history in safety.
Mr. Shaw, Wall Street, about a decade ago, in order to increase the profits they were earning in the rail industry, implemented a program called Precision Scheduled Railroading. The result of that is that Norfolk Southern reduced its workforce by almost 40% over 6 years. Meanwhile, in fact, Wall Street's goal was achieved. Profits soared for Norfolk Southern. You made over $3 billion in profits last year. I have been told by workers who work for your company and other rail companies that they are now being asked to do more work with fewer workers, and that includes safety inspections. So well before this disaster in East Palestine, we have been told about the potential safety hazards. Will you make a commitment right now to the American people that you will lead the industry in ending this disastrous precision scheduled railroading, which has slashed your workforce and made railroading much less safe? Yes or no, will you make that commitment?
Senator, I understand your concern, and I share that concern. And if you'll permit, I have a couple points on that. I became CEO in May of last year. Ever since that point, Senator, we've been on a hiring spree. The number of employees at Norfolk Southern today is 1,500 more than it was this time last year.
All right, you'll forgive me. I don't mean to be rude. We just don't have a whole lot of time. Yeah, I understand that, but you will not deny what you're trying to do is rebuild from the massive layoffs that took place. My question back to you again. Wall Street, not the industry, imposed this on the industry. Wall Street said we're not making enough money. Cut workers, cut workers, cut workers, even if it endangers safety. My question to you, very simply, sir, will you lead the industry in doing away with precision scheduled railroading? That concept.
Senator, in December of last year, I charted a new course in the industry. And I said we're going to move away from a near-term focus solely on profits, and that we're going to take a longer-term view that's founded on our engagement with our craft employees who are so critical to our success. We were the first to pivot out of it.
Alan Shaw, President and CEO of Norfolk Southern, questioned by Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, at today's Environment and Public Works Committee hearing. CBS News reports that after the derailment in East Palestine, concerned about an explosion, officials authorized a controlled burn of the chemicals, though the release raised more fears from residents about health risks associated with exposure to the toxic chemicals that were released into the air. More from today's hearing. Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, Republican from Oklahoma, asking whether the company that owned the rail cars that were vented and the chemical burned were consulted before this.
Were they in the room when the decision was being made? Because I've received reports that they weren't, so they weren't in the room?
No, sir. Not to my knowledge.
I just seen that kind of hard to believe, that considering that it's their car, it's their responsibility, and they weren't even considered before this decision to vent and burn it in the middle of a town. Doesn't that seem like possibly a mistake there?
Senator, Unified Command was focused solely on the health and safety of the community.
Right. So the people that was in charge of the car should probably have a say in that to make sure we know the best way to dispose of it.
My understanding at the time, from talking to experts, was that we were at risk of a catastrophic rupture that would have resulted in uncontrolled release of hazardous materials.
But it's my understanding, and I haven't been able to clarify this, that the report that I received was the fact that the car was actually working properly at the time, but the car's owners, the ones that were responsible for it, wasn't consulted before it was burned off. Now, I haven't been able to verify that, but I'm asking these questions because that's the information that I received. And if that's the case, I think that's an area for improvement.
Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, Republican from Oklahoma, questioning Norfolk Southern CEO and President Alan Shaw. Washington Post transportation reporter Ian Duncan has been covering today's Senate Environment and Public Works Committee hearing on the East Palestine, Ohio toxic train derailment, joining us now by phone. Thank you so much. The chair of the committee, Senator Tom Carper, tweeted ahead of the hearing that the residents there deserved accountability. He says, here's what I hope to answer. What went wrong? What do we need to do to fix it? What can we do to make sure it does not happen again? How were those questions addressed during the hearing?
I'm not sure that we got definitive answers really on any of those, to be honest. We did learn, I think, some of the most striking testimony from the witnesses was about what went wrong or what they think could have been done better. The thing that I think really escalated this incident was the decision to do the controlled burn of 5 of these tank cars. And there was an emergency response manager from Pennsylvania who was there who said that they didn't have good visibility on the plan and what Norfolk Southern wanted to do. And so they initially thought it was going to be 1 car that they would need to essentially do a controlled detonation of. And then it turned out that it was going to be 5. And he said that the difference between those 2 things and learning about the change was jaw-dropping. That was really kind of a level of detail that we haven't heard about how some of that decision-making was arrived at. The CEO of the railroad, Alan Shaw, he was asked repeatedly what would the company do, what would it commit to in terms of tightening up safety. They have announced a few changes this week already, and he was fairly reluctant to kind of commit to supporting new regulations or legislation. He kind of argued that safety is a priority for them, but it was a little short on specifics, I'd say.
On that issue of the proposed legislation, there were also 2 senators, a number of senators who appeared as witnesses, the 2 from Ohio, Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance, who are co-sponsoring some legislation. I want to play a couple of clips that I've pulled from them and then talk to you about what the proposal is and how it's being received.
Shouldn't take a train derailment for elected officials to put partisanship aside and work together for the people whom we serve, not corporations like Norfolk Southern. Lobbyists for the rail companies have spent years fighting every effort to strengthen rules to make our trains and our rail lines safer. Now Ohioans are paying the price.
I believe that we are the party of working people, but it's time to be the party of working people. We have a choice. Are we for big business and big government, or are we for the people of East Palestine? It's a time for choosing. Let's make the right one.
That's Senator J.D. Vance, Republican of Ohio. Before that, Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio. What type of reform are they putting forth, and how is it being received by the other senators?
So they have put forward a kind of multi-part proposal. There's some provisions in there to do with the sharing of information between railroads and emergency responders, which does seem like it wasn't perfect in this case. And there are provisions about detectors that railroads have installed to try and detect basically bearings that are about to overheat so that they can stop a train and inspect and potentially pull cars out. That's been an issue in this derailment as well. It would subject those to federal regulation for the first time. And then there is a provision in there too about requiring that trains have 2 crew, at least 2 crew. That's the standard now, but labor unions are worried that railroads are going to try and take that down to 1, or potentially automate trains entirely, and they see sort of having 2 crew as an important safety guarantee. So it would try and sort of address some things I think that are pretty specific to the derailment at East Palestine, and then tackle some other long-standing issues in the rail industry as well.
Specifically, Senator J.D. Vance called out some of his fellow Republicans who aren't supporting it.
Yeah, that was interesting. He sort of said that there were people out there who think that no regulation can be justified, and that it would be a sort of beginning of a return to having, government control essentially over railroads. And he tried to draw a distinction and say, no, like this bill is a set of safety regulations that should deserve wide support. It's not a government takeover of the industry or something like that.
We're talking with Ian Duncan from the Washington Post. Final question. This derailment and today's hearing getting a lot of attention. Why has it struck a nerve with both parties?
I think there are issues for both parties to grab onto here, and you did see a slight difference of emphasis. Some of the Republican senators were more interested in questioning the way that the federal EPA communicated about the risk to this community early on, and for Democrats, they were really pushing the railroad on its history of resistance to safety regulation, on job cuts, on not offering paid sick leave to employees. And I think there is also sort of some genuine bipartisanship here. It's very clear that this is a community that has a pretty long road ahead, and that there is a desire to help that community in East Palestine and show them that the federal government can step in and ensure that the railroad commits to doing what it needs to do to make them whole again.
Ian Duncan covers transportation issues for the Washington Post. Find his work at WashingtonPost.com, and on Twitter it's @iduncan. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
A story from the Wall Street Journal. President Biden proposed a $6.9 trillion budget that calls for reducing deficits and raising taxes on wealthy people and large corporations, detailing a policy vision that isn't expected to gain momentum in Congress, but is an opening salvo in spending talks with Republicans. Mr. Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget plan, released Thursday, calls for an increase over the roughly $6.4 trillion that the White House expects the federal government to spend this fiscal year. It would reduce federal budget deficits by nearly $3 trillion over the next decade, the White House said. President Biden unveiling this plan in Philadelphia at the Finishing Trades Initiative, a union training center.
Here's why I'm here today. For too long, working people have been breaking their necks, but the economy's left them behind. Working people like you, while those at the top get away with everything and get everything. One of the reasons why I ran for president, and I mean this sincerely, you may remember when I announced, I said there were 3 reasons I was running. 1, to restore the soul of America, restore some decency and honor to the system. And 2, to rebuild the backbone of the country, the middle class. When the middle class does well, the poor have a way up and the wealthy still do very well. And the 3rd one is to unite the country. Didn't think we could do that. But as we've seen, all the talk about we never get any cooperation from the other team, the last 2 years, we passed some pretty big things with bipartisan support. I ran to grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up and not the top down. And I know when I grew up, my dad's kitchen table, not a whole lot trickled down economics into my kitchen table for my dad. That's why I wanted to come here today to lay out the next part of my economic plan. My budget I'm sending to Congress today. And if I could hold for just a second, I want to be clear, and I'll be clear to the press as well. The fact is that the Speaker of the House he's a very conservative guy, and he has even more conservative group with him. But he and I met early on, and he said, what are we going to do about the budget? And I said, let's make a deal. Let's meet. I said, I'm going to introduce my budget on the 9th of March. You introduce yours, and we'll sit down and we'll go line by line, and we'll go through it. We'll see what we can agree on and what we disagree on, and then fight it out in the Congress. So I want to make it clear, I'm ready to meet with the Speaker anytime, tomorrow, if he has his budget. Lay it down, tell me what you want to do, I'll show you what I want to do, see what we can agree on, what we don't agree on, let's see what we vote on. Now,
President Biden today in Philadelphia at the Finishing Trades Institute in that city. He spoke for nearly an hour, laying out aspects of his budget. C-SPAN covered it all. You can find the video at cspan.org. Here's a minute of it where he talks about budget deficit reduction and increasing taxes on the wealthy.
Now my budget's going to give working people a fighting chance. It's going to create good-paying jobs. And we can pay for these jobs by reducing the deficit 2 ways. Like, for example, cutting $160 billion in Medicare expenses is one. But we also have to ask the wealthiest and biggest corporations to begin to pay their fair share. And cutting subsidies for special interests. And by the way, in my first 2 years in office, this first 2 years, I brought down the deficit a record $1.7 trillion, more than any president has in American history, while doing all the rest of this stuff. Down. And the budget I'm introducing today is going to reduce the deficit by nearly $10 billion or $3 billion, over trillion over 10 years. Another big disagreement with my MAGA Republicans, and by the way, this ain't your father's Republican Party. There's a lot of really good Republicans. There really are. But they're afraid to step out of line because they'll get primaried and they'll lose elections. MAGA Republicans, you know, they don't want things that particularly are going to help working families like healthcare, education, public safety, which are going to raise costs on folks. Look, MAGA Republicans also refuse to raise a single penny in new taxes on the wealthiest people.
President Joe Biden in Philadelphia. Andrea Shalal is White House and economics correspondent with Thomson Reuters, has been taking a closer look at the president's proposed federal budget for the next fiscal year. Joining us now by phone. Thank you so much. Your article has this. President Biden's proposal, which resurrects many items stripped from last year's budget plan, faces even stiffer opposition in Congress this year after Republicans won control of the House of Representatives in November's midterm elections. What are some of those items?
Well, a lot of the items that were part of President Biden's Build Back Better initiative, which was subsequently renamed other things, that included, for instance, an expansion of continuation of an expanded child tax credit. That was next. Other items included paid leaves, included free community college. So all of those things that are part of his social and economic agenda are right back in this budget, and they're going to face really a very steep climb in Congress, and many people are just writing them off already, given opposition both among some Democrats, and notably Joe Manchin, who had been kind of in opposition last year, but also now the relationship, of course, with the majority is now held by the Republicans in the House of Representatives. So it makes the calculus much more difficult for Biden in terms of getting these priorities enacted.
In terms of overall numbers, how much does the president want to spend in the next fiscal year, and how does that compare to the current fiscal year? And the increase historically, is it large or small?
President Biden is proposing a budget of $6.8 trillion for fiscal 24. That is up from, not a huge increase from what was spent before, but it will leave a deficit, and the deficits will be over $1 trillion each year for the next 10 years, according to the Office of Management and Budget.
And which programs does he want to give an increased amount of money?
Well, there's quite a lot of increased spending in this budget. They're spending on everything from research on clean energy initiatives. There is funding that's included that is already earmarked under the CHIPS Act for semiconductor manufacturing. There is money to pay for, we already mentioned some of the agenda items, increased child care. There's a 10% increase in funding for child care facilities, also to expand preschool and make it available for all 4-year-olds in the United States. That's 4 million children. Those are large ticket items that the Biden administration argues will actually help the U.S. economy because they will allow more people to seek work outside the home, and that will hopefully be good for what is still a very tight labor market.
We're talking with Andrea Shalal from Thomson Reuters. This all comes as the president has been in discussions with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy over the budget, but also raising the national debt limit. Where does that stand?
The two sides are really stuck on this issue. The Republicans have insisted that they won't negotiate on raising the debt ceiling now at $31.4 trillion unless Biden agrees to reduce spending. He's just delivered a budget that essentially is in direct defiance of that demand from Republicans because it increases spending. And so you can imagine that the response today has been pretty intense. We've had pushback from everyone, including Senator Mitch McConnell, to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and which calls it, a fiscal and economic disaster. So there's this that it basically sets up months and months and months of fighting over the budget, and it'll all come to a head in June when the Treasury Department says the debt ceiling will be reached and it won't be able to pay bills anymore. That if the U.S. government does not pay its bills, that would be a disaster for the U.S. economy. Economists agree on that. Treasury Department has warned that. The president has warned that. And I think the general thinking is that eventually Republicans will, come around and agree to raise the debt ceiling, but they will try to extract more than a pound of flesh from Biden in the process.
Andrea Shalal is White House and economics correspondent with Thomson Reuters. Her story's at Reuters.com. And on Twitter, it's at Andrea_Shalal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And CNN has an article about the president's fiscal year 2024 budget plan looking at the proposed tax increases. They include a minimum tax on billionaires, 25% minimum tax on all income of the wealthiest 0.1% of Americans, including their appreciated assets. That would hit those with a net worth of more than $100 million. Also increasing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28% and repealing the tax cuts for the wealthy, as the president describes them, that were put in place under former President Donald Trump. That from CNN. Some congressional reaction to the president's budget proposal. Senator John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, the minority whip, speaking on the Senate floor this morning.
Later today, the President of the United States will release his budget. We haven't seen the details of it yet, so I'm not prepared. I'll have more to say about that next week when we have an opportunity to drill down. But I think what we do know about it, and I can predict this because it's pretty easy to predict, that the President's budget will include a lot more spending, a lot more taxing, and that after the last 2 years here where through a budget reconciliation process, the President and the Democrats here in Congress passed almost another $3 trillion in spending and taxing and debt outside of the normal appropriations process. And that at a time when revenue, last year revenue, was at a 20-year high. In fact, the revenue coming into the federal government in the last fiscal year as a percentage of our entire economy, it was higher than it's been, with 3 exceptions in history. One was in the late 1990s at the end of the dot-com bubble, and 2 times in World War II. So record level of revenue as a percentage of GDP, and yet the President and his budget is going to propose a whole lot more spending and a whole lot more taxing and a whole lot more government. Expanding, growing government. That's what we expect his budget to do. And like I said, I'll have more to say about that next week.
Senator John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, the minority whip, on the Senate floor this morning. The House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, opened his weekly news conference talking about the president's budget plan.
The president's budget will be released today. It's a forward-looking budget that invests in the health, the safety, the economic well-being of the American people. It's a budget that will strengthen and protect Medicare and Social Security. The President's budget is designed to build an economy from the middle out and the bottom up. The President's budget will reduce the deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years, building upon $1.7 trillion in deficit reduction that has occurred over the previous 2 years. We continue to get big things done for the American people, to strengthen the economy, and to do it in a fiscally responsible way. At the same time, we're still waiting for extreme MAGA Republicans in the House to show us your plan. How do you want to invest in building an economy for everyday Americans? How do you propose dealing with the challenges that you often talk about with respect to the deficit? Are you committed to undermining Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? Show us your plan. What are you hiding from the American people?
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, the minority leader, at his news conference today on Capitol Hill. On Wall Street, the Dow down 543, NASDAQ down 237, S&P down 73. Reuters reporting that Wall Street's three major stock indexes closed lower on Thursday, with bank stocks creating the biggest drag, while investors also worried that Friday's jobs report could spur more aggressive interest rate hikes from the Federal Reserve. Also, the Labor Department today saying the number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits rose last week by the most in 5 months, up 21,000 to 211,000, but layoffs as a whole are still historically low. Unemployment rate currently 3.4%. The Senate today confirming former IRS Commissioner, acting, Daniel Werfel to be the permanent commissioner. This comes just a few days before the tax filing deadline. The vote in the Senate was 54 to 42, 6 Republicans joining most Democrat in voting yes. Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Susan Collins from Maine, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Tom Tillis from North Carolina, and Todd Young from Indiana. 1 Democrat joined most Republicans in voting no, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. CNBC writes that Daniel Werfel will take the helm at the tax agency during a period of increased scrutiny, largely driven by the new Republican majority in the House. Of particular interest to the GOP is a provision in last year's Inflation Reduction Act, which funds the IRS with an additional $80 billion over the next decade. Ahead of the vote in the Senate today, Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, promoting the nomination.
Mr. Werfel told the Senate Finance Committee that he will make his priorities delivering fairness and building trust. We know that he's going to do just that because he's done it before. President Obama asked Mr. Werfel during a very challenging time to serve as acting commissioner in 2013. Then the Internal Revenue Service was under intense scrutiny for its sloppy reviews of tax-exempt organizations and their political activities. Mr. Werfel did his job in a way that improved trust in the Internal Revenue Service. He worked with both sides of the Senate Finance Committee. Our investigation found that both left-leaning and right-leaning groups were affected. The late Senator Orrin Hatch, a friend to many in this chamber, told me on a number of occasions how much he appreciated Danny Werfel's professionalism and his open door for all sides. Mr. President, it is time to rebalance the American system of tax enforcement. Audits today too often are a burden that fall heavily on working families, on nurses and firefighters and teachers and the middle class. It's far too easy for the very wealthy and the multinational corporations that have armies of tax lawyers and accountants to get away with cheating in breaking the law. That's what Democrats sought to address in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I understand that not everybody in the chamber shares those priorities. However, Mr. Werfel, and I'll close with this, has committed to the Finance Committee that he is going to work with both sides of the aisle and bring transparency to the job. That includes how the IRS will spend funding to improve taxpayer services, upgrade information technology, and crack down on those wealthy tax cheats.
Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, Finance Committee chair on the Senate floor just before the vote to confirm Daniel Werfel to be the IRS Commissioner. As mentioned earlier, Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, the only Democrat to vote no, he put out a statement that reads, "At every turn, this administration has ignored congressional intent when implementing the Inflation Reduction Act. While Daniel Werfel is supremely qualified to serve as the IRS Commissioner, I have zero faith he will be given the autonomy to perform the job in accordance with the law, and for that reason I cannot support his nomination." An article from thehill.com explains Senator Manchin is fuming mad over the administration's implementation of the generous electric vehicle tax credits that were also included in the sweeping climate and tax reform bill passed last year. Washington Today continues in a moment.
There are a lot of places to get political information, but only at C-SPAN do you get it straight from the source. No matter where you are from or where you stand on the issues, C-SPAN is America's network. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. If it happens here, or here, or here, or anywhere that matters, America is watching on C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now app and wherever you get your podcasts. The first bill that has passed both the Republican-controlled House and the Democratic-controlled Senate this year, it's also the first bill that President Biden says he will veto, is on its way to the president's desk. The bill would nullify a Labor Department regulation allowing retirement plan managers to prioritize environmental, social, and governance factors, known as ESG, over maximum returns for shareholders when making investment decisions. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, holding a bill enrollment ceremony this morning on Capitol Hill.
This resolution that strongly deserves to become law. It passed the House and it passed the Senate on a bipartisan basis. Unfortunately, our president wants to pick the left-leaning activism over the return on your investment. So literally what he is telling businesses, they have to go woke and not look at the return of the investment. So for everyone who invests in a retirement account, you can't look to get the highest return. Why do you invest? You invest to get a higher return so you have money in the future. Now he's taken that away. He's prioritized his own politics over people, and that is wrong. I hope the president will actually do the right thing, side with the American people, and sign this bill immediately. Otherwise, he'll be on record defending a woke ESG rule that undermines Americans' financial security.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy at today's enrollment ceremony for this bill to block the retirement plan ESG rule that was issued by the Biden administration. President Biden putting out a statement saying that he does plan to veto the bill because, quote, the rule is not a mandate. It does not require any fiduciary to make investment decisions based solely on ESG factors. The rule simply makes sure that retirement plan fiduciaries must engage in a risk and return analysis of their investment decisions and recognizes that these factors can be relevant to that analysis. Overriding a presidential veto requires a two-thirds majority vote in the House and the Senate, and based upon the vote totals when the bill passed, in the House it was 216 to 204, and in the Senate 50 to 46. Unless some members and senators change their votes, the veto is likely to be sustained. The process being used in that bill is called the Congressional Review Act, or CRA, allows Congress to weigh in and vote on blocking proposed major regulations. The House today passed another CRA resolution dealing with an EPA rule defining what are the waters of the United States, is known as WOTUS. what waters are subject to regulation under the Clean Water Act. Here's some of the debate on the House floor before this vote. Congressman Sam Graves, Republican from Missouri, chairs the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee.
Decades of agency interpretation and misinterpretations have created uncertainty for rural communities, for farmers, for ranches, for businesses and industries who rely on clean water. Although the 2020 Navigable Waters Protection Rule finally provided long-awaited clarity on the scope of WOTUS, the new administration decided to unravel the Water Protection Rule and attempt to replace it, once again creating confusion and chaos. The definition of WOTUS matters to the everyday lives of people all over the country, including my district. For instance, I have a constituent who wanted to build a pond on his property and had received local and state permits to do just that. But then the Army Corps of Engineers, they stepped in and they said he would have to spend $165,000 in environmental mitigation. This is absolutely outrageous. Returning to a more costly, burdensome, and broad WOTUS definition could have a massive impact on local communities and Americans' ability to do their jobs and manage their own private property.
Congressman Sam Graves, Republican from Missouri, chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, today on the House floor, opposing this bill and therefore supporting the new Waters of the United States regulation. That committee's ranking Democrat Rick Larsen of Washington State.
Clean water is a human right, and the health and safety of our communities and the success of our economy depend upon it. And House Democrats stand for clean water, and today I rise to oppose H.J. Res. 27. Last Congress, we passed a bipartisan, once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, investing almost $13 billion in clean water infrastructure upgrades and creating jobs in communities across this country. The BIL showed what Congress can do when we focus on the needs of American families. Yet, instead of putting people over pollution, this CRA does the opposite. Now, my state of Washington is defined by its clean water, including the health of the Puget Sound and the hundreds of lakes and thousands of miles of rivers and streams throughout the state. My constituents know that rivers, streams, and wetlands are intrinsically connected. Pollution that starts in one body of water does not stay put. House Democrats believe we can protect clean water while providing certainty to businesses, to farmers, to Americans who depend upon clean water for their lives and livelihoods.
Congressman Rick Larsen, Democrat from Washington State, on the House floor. The House went on to pass this bill by a vote of 227 to 198. It was mostly along party lines, with 218 Republicans voting yes, along with 9 Democrats. And on the no side, 197 Democrats and 1 Republican, Brian Fitzpatrick, from Pennsylvania. This bill now goes to the Senate. The new EPA regulation on waters of the United States is scheduled to take effect March 20th. Bloomberg Law reports that 26 states, along with agriculture and industry groups, have joined half a dozen federal lawsuits against the EPA New Waters of the United States rule. And there's also a pending Supreme Court case related to the scope of the Clean Water Act, which could affect this new rule and the lawsuits. It's Sackett v. EPA, expected to be decided by the Supreme Court by June. This is Washington Today. From Associated Press, a barrage of more than 80 Russian missiles and a smaller number of exploding drones hit residential buildings and critical infrastructure across Ukraine on Thursday, killing 6 people and leaving hundreds of thousands without heat or electricity. The largest such attack in 3 weeks also put Europe's largest nuclear plant at risk by knocking it off the power grid for hours before it was reconnected. Russian Defense Ministry said the strikes were in retaliation for a recent incursion into the Bryansk region in western Russia by what Moscow claims were Ukrainian saboteurs. That from Associated Press. The state of the war in Ukraine coming up today in Washington at a House Intelligence Committee hearing with leaders of the U.S. intelligence agencies testifying. Here's Congressman Jason Crow, Democrat from Colorado, asking CIA Director William Burns.
There's a lot of debate within Congress right now and with the administration about both the quantity and the quality of the military assistance to Ukraine. My understanding is that Russia does not have the capability of any major offensives or breakthroughs currently in Ukraine, that they've been degraded sufficiently. So Director Burns, is that your understanding that in 2023, that the Russians couldn't conduct major offenses or have major strategic success in Ukraine?
Yes, sir. It's our judgment that the Russian military is capable of making incremental tactical gains, and they made some in the course of the offensive they've launched over the last 4 or 5 weeks in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. But it is our collective assessment, I think, that for a whole variety of reasons that Director Haynes mentioned, munition shortages, morale problems, manpower problems, conflicts within their own military leadership, that they're unlikely to be able to make significant strategic breakthroughs or sustain them over the course of the rest of this year.
And is it your understanding that Vladimir Putin's strategy is to recapitalize the military, to consolidate support, and to rebuild his infrastructure so that he will be capable of making advances or strategic success within 2024 and 2025, that he's taking a longer-term view?
Yeah, I think Vladimir Putin is very much taking a longer-term view. I think he's doubling down in many respects right now. I believe he's convinced that he can make time work for him, that he can grind down the Ukrainians through this war of attrition, that he can wear down Western supporters of Ukraine. And he's convinced also, and has been for some time, that Ukraine matters more to him than to us. Therefore, the challenge, I think, is to puncture that view.
So given that, that decisions have to be made about relative risks and where risks lie, short-term risks versus long-term risks, would it be your best advice that we transition the nature of our support to look more towards hardening Ukraine and military modernization efforts that would look further out in the horizon than the shorter-term efforts?
Well, I avoid offering free policy advice in my current role these days. What I would say as a matter of intelligence assessment is that the next several months, the next 4, 5, 6 months are going to be crucial on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think any prospect for a serious negotiation, which President Putin I do not believe is ready for today, is going to depend on progress on the battlefield. Therefore, I think analytically, what's important is to provide all the support that we possibly can, which is exactly what the President and our Western allies are doing for the Ukrainians as they prepare for a significant offensive in the spring. And then at the same time, it's not really an either-or question, just as you said, Congressman, it's looking at the long-term security needs of Ukraine to help ensure a situation where Vladimir Putin's Russia is not going to try to mount another offensive or another invasion as they did at the beginning of last year.
CIA Director William Burns, questioned by Congressman Jason Crow, Democrat from Colorado, at today's House Intelligence Committee hearing on worldwide threats. The other witnesses were the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, also the heads of the FBI, NSA, and DIA. There was a moment during the hearing when Congressman Darren LaHood, Republican from Illinois, said he believes he was unlawfully monitored by the FBI. He said the Office of the Director of National Intelligence declassified a 2021 report in which was listed abuses of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, and the report said that the FBI had, under Section 702 of FISA, inappropriately searched the data of an unnamed member of Congress and a local political organization to determine if they had ties to foreign intelligence. And Congressman LaHood said he believes he's that member of Congress in that report. C-SPAN covered this entire hearing. You can find the full video at our website at cspan.org. An update on the health of the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. His communications director David Popp putting out a statement today. Leader McConnell tripped at a dinner event Wednesday evening and has been admitted to the hospital and is being treated for a concussion. He's expected to remain in the hospital for a few days of observation and treatment. The leader is grateful to the medical professionals for their care and to his colleagues for their warm wishes. Well, some of those warm wishes coming today in the U.S. Senate from the chaplain Barry Black, the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and you'll hear from the Minority Whip John Thune.
Today, lead our lawmakers so that your name will be honored. And Lord, bless Senator McConnell with a speedy recovery. We pray in your marvelous name. Amen.
My thoughts this morning are with my good friend, Leader Mitch McConnell, who is recovering in the hospital after an accident last night. This morning I offer a prayer of strength and healing for the leader and his family. I called the leader this morning and spoke briefly with his staff to extend my prayers and well wishes. My thoughts are also with Leader McConnell's family and his team. I join every single one of my colleagues in wishing Leader McConnell a speedy and full recovery.
Mr. President, before I begin, I just want to say that, along with all of my colleagues, that my thoughts and prayers are with Leader McConnell this morning, with his family, with his team, and that, along with our colleagues, I look forward to his speedy return to the United States Senate.
Senator John Thune, before that Senator Chuck Schumer, and the first voice was the Senate chaplain, retired Rear Admiral Barry Black, from this morning. Again, a statement from Senator McConnell's office saying the senator tripped Wednesday night and is being treated in the hospital for concussion, expected to be there for a couple of days. Senator McConnell is 81 years old. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.